And hi, everyone. Good morning, good afternoon, good evening, wherever you are. My name is Bonnie Stewart, and I want to welcome you to a Social Sciences and Humanities Research Council funded insight development project that is titled Digital Classroom Tools and Data Risks, Faculty Perspectives, Knowledge and Experiences, I believe. And this is a project that I got a grant for from Canada's SSHRC Council about 2 years ago, have been working on with an excellent team, 2/3 of whom are here today with me. And we're going to share, just sort of have a kind of part workshop, part conversation about what we've been finding and really just what kind of barriers we're seeing around data in higher ed today. So I'm delighted that you're here. And I want to thank you for being here. I want to remind you that this is recorded. And I want to, I guess, ask, where is here? We are based at the University of Windsor in the Faculty of Ed, and we are running this session through our Office of Open Learning with thanks to them. And maybe Erica will take away our land acknowledgement as we begin.
Perfect. Thank you, Bonnie. So we would like to begin by acknowledging that the land which we gather is the traditional territory of the Ottawandaran, Anishinaabe, and Haudenosaunee peoples. The University of Windsor sits on the traditional territory of the Three Fires Confederacy of First Nations, which includes the Ojibwa, the Ottawa, and the Potawatomi. We respect a longstanding relationship with the First Nations people in this place in the 100-mile Windsor-Essex Peninsula and the Stratus Le Detroit of Detroit.
Thank you, Erica. And in the picture in front of you, this is our team who've been working on this project for the last couple of years. Erica, whom you just heard speak, is the tallest person in that photo. Erica, why don't you go ahead and introduce yourself?
Sure. My name is Erica Miklas, and I am a PhD candidate at the University of Windsor in the Joint PhD program. And I've been on the project for, I think, a year or so now.
Absolutely. It's been great to have you on it. And Sam?
So my name is Samantha Sarek. I started working on this project with Bonnie at the end of 2020. So I've been here for a little bit. I'm just wrapping up my master's right now. But yeah, so I've been on the project for a few years now.
Yep, and Sam was actually part of writing this grant application with me. I am the person in the with the glasses and in sort of the part back of the picture there. I'm the PI on the project, and we also have Tuli on our project who is in the front. The smallest person in height in the photo, but Tu is currently on her honeymoon and is not with us today, but will be presenting on this project with us at Congress coming up in May. And what we've been doing, sorry, just figuring out my touchscreen, I guess we're going to start by looking at the Little Red Schoolhouse here. And you know, many of us didn't necessarily attend a one-room school, but nonetheless, this idea of school as a contained space is probably familiar to most of us in this room today. So I want to open this up. I want to get people into the chat and start to make this conversational. Please, I invite you in the chat. What is your first memory of school as an environment, particularly as a built environment, of place? Oh, whoops. I'm sorry. I'm trying to open the chat, but I'm afraid that I'm going to have to there we are. You're in a trailer out behind the main school in kindergarten. Heavy dark brick building. Baby chicks. Cardboard blocks. Colorful. Jungle gyms. Nap time. Desks in rows, books and posters. So a lot of material pieces. And what I'm curious about is, as we talk about these kind of an old house, wow, toys and mats, Cool, tall person, small desks, tall people problems, Erica, drawing classes. It's interesting because I'm aware that there are people in this session who were educated in a variety of spaces in very different geographic locations. There's a fair number of commonalities there. We tend to talk about school as a semi-commonality that many of us have access to, and a lot of physical space things that are pretty similar, which is interesting, right? The school as bounded by those four walls of the classroom and an enclosed space. The no windows piece seems a little harsh for sure. Here's the thing. We are no longer in that little red schoolhouse. And many of us who've gone into education still tend to think of the work that we do as shaped by that concept of the classroom. But in truth, the four walls that we work within have now become much more metaphorical. They're wired and they're digital, right? And it's not just our classroom tools that are digital post-pandemic. Many of us, even those who hadn't taught online previous to the pandemic, became folks who had to learn how to teach in Blackboard or Moodle or whatever, but it's not just classroom tools. It's our financial systems, our registration systems, our grading systems. Everything that we work with, these collections of corporate vendor services and kind of online program management systems or OPM systems. This is what the four walls of the classroom and of academia really are right now. And they're not just wired, they have effectively become tripwired. And we don't talk about this because we can't necessarily see it, but we're all kind of living in a version of Ocean's 8, except that I think in many ways the heist is actually on us, right? We may be at the center there, the art objects, except that it's our data that these systems are set up to try to abduct or pull out or extract. And unfortunately, it's also the data of our students. So each time that we are bringing students into what we tend to still think of as the four walls of the classroom, we are also bringing them into a space that is by design and by default extracting significant data from them. And I'd like to go back to the chat. I'm curious. What kind of digital tools do you use, right? Not everyone here may be in the classroom. We have folks who work in library. We have folks who may work in admin. What kind of tools are you using in your work in higher ed right now? And I'll wait, we can see what comes up. LibGuides, Zotero, Pressbooks, H5P, Canva, Office 365, so much Office 365, which means that we are also basically all getting integrated with OpenAI, ChatGPT type tools in 321, Google, Padlet. I'm seeing all kinds of things go across here. Blackboard, Moodle, Brightspace, ChatGPT. Okay, so all kinds of different apps. Excellent. Perusal, Jamboard, Wordbook, Pressbooks, EndNote, Brightspace. Thank you. So this is a huge hypothesis, one of my favorites, a huge collection of tools which serve many great educational purposes, many great workplace purposes. They bring, hopefully, value to the things that we're trying to do in higher ed. All of these platforms, every time that we engage with them, we are leaving traces, clicks, patterns, right? Our keystrokes are collected. Now, is somebody sitting in a room looking at the collation of everything that we as an individual do? No. Could those patterns be put together across the collection of these vendor platforms? Yes, they could. Do we know what happens to these traces that we're leaving? And that's really what this conversation is about. How many of you have a clear sense of where your traces go? Just in the chat. Robin, I bet you do. I know that I have tried to look into this over the last couple of years as part of leading this project, and there's a few tools that I'm really comfortable with. I understand basically what happens when I use hypothesis or bring my students onto it. I have a reasonable understanding of what happens when I use Mentimeter and bring my students onto it. Unfortunately, for the most part, almost everything else I use, I don't. Our campus is a Microsoft campus. My last campus was at that time a Google campus. I was, in a privacy and security sense, a little more comfortable when we moved to a Microsoft campus, but now with the integration with all kinds of other tools, I no longer can keep up with where my data and the data that my students are contributing through their traces and clicks is going. And this has a name. This is called
datafication. Yes, so datafication is both the process and the infrastructure by which the traces of online engagement on the digital platforms we're using, so every click, even the ones we end up deleting, are collected and stored on a mass scale and potentially collated with that collected elsewhere. So the datafied digital systems have permeated higher education over the past decade. So things like registration, grading, financial operations, and often teaching all take place through digital platforms that extract and collate the data about students as well as faculty and staff. At the level of these data system processes, academics may not have the knowledge or practices to fully grasp the shift in their workplace that datafication represents. But our research suggests that educators do understand the shift that datafication represents, and they have strong beliefs about how institutions should proceed to protect both students and academia itself.
I love this slide. There is value to data. It is great to know when a student isn't necessarily engaging with the course material that you've put up. And sometimes part of this datafication means that our Brightspace system or Blackboard system can send us a little ping or can let us know that we might want to touch base individually with that student. At the same time, particularly at the mass aggregate level, a lot of what analytics and data systems are doing and claiming to do is, at least from an educator perspective, kind of like telling us that the bananas are boneless. If my class is really not engaged, hopefully I, as the person who's leading that class, do already know that. There are other issues with datafication. We have a lot of tools that are algorithmically sort of claiming to make decisions for us or support us in making decisions. And they tend to work on these predictive claims. The truth is that these tools, like ChatGPT now, which is predictive in its writing of material for us, they are not actually predicting things. They are they are categorizing, and they are basing what comes next on what has come before. So they are working with the entire database that they have access to, which is huge, but it is also based in what has happened before, which tends to reinforce stereotypes, tends to reinforce the sort of, I think it's called reversion to the mean, not the meme, the mean. I'm not sure if that's the right term, but that kind of falling to the middle. So students particularly who come from marginalized populations, racialized populations, populations with disability, populations of students who are gender diverse, Kathy O'Neill's work, which is referenced here, has pointed out how these kind of algorithmic tools will tend to go, oh, well, you live in this zip code and people there are poor, so we're not going to give you a student loan because you won't be able to pay it back. Many of these tools do not help us necessarily make a better world. Many of these tools also have other really significant issues and risks for particularly our students. So I don't know, how many of you have heard of LexisNexis before? Some of my librarian folks may be familiar with this. LexisNexis is part of the RELX or RELX. It used to be called Reed Elsevier, and Elsevier is a term that should be pretty familiar to most of us in higher ed. They're a data cartel, essentially, and they literally pull in data, including data from library patrons, and they broker it, they sell it to, for instance, ICE, which is the American Immigration and Customs Enforcement site. So getting people deported based on the work that they are being asked to do in their universities. These giant corporate cartels are collecting masses and masses of information. They have incredible power. Most of it has not fully been seen yet, but each time that we are asking students to engage with these platforms and tools in the process of registering and engaging with higher ed systems, we risk their deportment. We risk the fact that they could be these kinds of tools could be selling information to things like life insurance companies. There could be health info involved. We are making students vulnerable and possibly ourselves vulnerable because of this infrastructure that is now really the four walls of our classroom. There's one further problem, which is simply that when we normalize the datafication of all of our systems, it can lead to really reductive approaches. Many of us in education have been talking for a long time about how we shouldn't just teach to the test, because if we focus entirely on the test, then the only thing that the classroom becomes about is succeeding in that test. Data can operate in the same ways, where if we focus entirely, not that there isn't value in having some data on who is in our systems, et cetera. But when we do not control that data, when we do not understand that data, we are, as a higher ed sector and system, extremely vulnerable to corporate decisions about what higher ed should be and what our goals should be as institutions, as educators, and as a sector. So, do any of us really know? How many of you, not just about the platforms that you use in your work, but do you have any sense, do you have any conversations on your campuses about what happens to student data, who it's accessible to, or your own data, right? How many times are you checking your students' work? Do you know what happens to that data that's collected? Nobody talks about it. Yeah. That's been pretty much a fairly common experience. And Robin brings up a really interesting point there. Charlene says she's asked. Robin says she's asked. It's hard to get information. George says he's asked. A lot of the information has ended up siloed in IT, and I understand why, but instead of being kind of a cross-campus conversation between educators, decision makers, different forms of knowledge holders, electronic monitoring policies tend to be very vague and generic. Most of the policy work, and this was really what our study over the last few years has surfaced, is that we are not having these conversations at a broad level. So I'll let one of my RAs take it away.
So our 2020 pilot survey focused on the data practices and perspectives of higher education faculty. So it yielded 339 respondents from 25 different countries. And on the screen here, we have Bonnie's call for participants, which she posted through a tweet asking if individuals teach in a university and they would be using any educational technologies either in face-to-face or online courses for the 2020-2021 academic year. So the COVID-19 pandemic actually saw higher education infrastructures move towards datafied systems at more of an accelerated pace on a global level, amplifying that datafication in the higher education system. So with the rapid shift to emergency remote education in March 2020, adaptability really took precedence over the deep consideration for the ethical and safety and privacy implications of hurriedly adopting these datafied systems into the higher education infrastructures. So the survey actually occurred at the peak of the pandemic, where everyone was going online, in order to find out what educators knew about the tools they were using and what they felt like their institutions should be doing. So basically, we found that 2/3 of educators didn't know where the servers for their learning management systems were actually teaching on was.
So we want to know, you can put in the chat, why does server location matter? So any ideas are welcome in the chat. Sorry, they all came in all at once. I saw different countries have different laws, which yes, about who and how to access. Yeah, basically laws in different countries are different, specifically laws within the US. For people who are outside of the US, a quick little example. When I was in my master's, I had to get RIB approval and I wanted to do transcribing a little bit faster than me just sitting there and typing. And so I tried to get a service that was offered on just a random website that I had Googled and found. And RIB came back and told me that I'm not allowed because their data was housed in the US and that the privacy laws are different. So I wasn't allowed to use that. But yes, let's see what I said.
Right. And these types of things are the tripwires that exist, right? We, for the most part, 66% of our 339 respondents. Now, again, we only asked short proxy questions. They were simply meant to surface, broadly speaking, what do people know about these tools that we're being asked to use? We don't know a lot. And that lack of knowledge creates tripwires for our students. This slide is a slide of kind of the ways in which all of these data collecting systems can do the work that they do. And this is from 2017 or 18 by Cracked Labs, but they looked at Axiom and Oracle and some of the biggest corporate data collection pieces, and they collect and collate all of these pieces. And one of the elements that I circled in the bottom right corner is they can determine, right, in their ranking, their personalizing, their rating, their scoring, whether someone is rejected by banks, insurers, employers, and landlords. This type of collation can also determine whether a student, for instance, who is subject to the data privacy laws of a country that is not their own country, is at risk in a different way. So for those of us outside of the US, because so many of our tools do come from the US, that is important. For those of you in the EU, as Kate mentioned, in Ireland, you're subject to GDPR. And so there tend to be somewhat more transparent policies and maybe a little bit more discussion of these things simply because of the existence of the GDPR rules. But overall, we are kind of all subject to these things that we can't even see. And in the course of just doing our jobs, we're asking our students to engage in them as well.
So the 2020 pilot survey found that there was not a lot of data knowledge or practices, but there were deeply held ethics. So educators might not know a lot about data, but they do care, much like the broader population of people.
And this is a Pew Research piece from a couple of years ago, just saying that for the most part, people really do tend to feel that they don't have any control over this. We live in this kind of click yes culture, and we've almost been acculturated to just assuming that this is just something that this is how it has to be. And yet almost nobody wants it to be that way.
So for the 2021 study, we did a comparative case study, and we wanted to really find out more about the practices that shape this reality, and more on the individual educator and institutional practices. And so we had 11 participants within 6 countries participate.
Some of those participants are really awesome. Here today. Welcome.
So what we found was really 2 different major themes with a few sub-themes within them. And so we decided on beliefs, so kind of what individuals think about datafication and datafication in higher education, and then barriers, so what were the barriers to knowledge within about datafication, and barriers really from different levels too. So individual barriers, institutional barriers that are placed on individuals, and then barriers that come from policy. And so part of our results was really that campuses need more data conversations, and that a lot of this discussion is segmented off to IT, and that the majority of participants didn't feel that they were invited to the table or welcome at the table to have these conversations, even though the participants are really the ones who are educating others and using these tools and need to know this information. They were kind of left out of the conversation.
And even those who were responsible for educational technologies on their campuses or in their environments, like many of you who shared in the chat that, you know, you've been trying to have these conversations, we do not seem to have surfaced a way of demanding a different infrastructure for this decision making yet. And that's why I think that even, you know, open public talks like this are important. And we so appreciate you being here, because we can hear from other people that we all have the same problem, and it reinforces what we were finding in our data as well. We also found, I guess, in keeping with the pilot surveys findings, that people didn't necessarily have a huge amount of knowledge, but they did very much care about particularly the ethics of data. In our case study, because we went deeper and looked at cross-case comparisons, as well as looking at all of our participants as a case, we found that there was a distinction. People, for the most part, didn't necessarily feel confident about process knowledge when it came to data. They were not being acculturated by their campuses or their institutions to understand specifically what the data privacy rules were around the tools that they were using. Their digital literacies were not necessarily being fostered by their campuses in the how-to sense. But at the above the process level, at the paradigm level, where they were thinking about the paradigm shift that this datafication represents, the paradigm shift of trading in those 4 walls of the classroom for these wired and tripwired complex institutions where an awful lot of power is invisibly held, not by the institution itself, but by vendors. People had very strong both feelings about that, but also beliefs about what should happen based in what the mandate of higher education has been. And we felt that it was really, really important to value that paradigm knowledge, that it is knowledge about higher education and what role higher education, when it is funded, etc., can play in a society, but that it is generally being almost sort of invisibilized from the conversation by the lack of process knowledge and the lack of institutional efforts to build data literacies and process knowledge.
From that point, our research found that institutions shape faculty data practices and attitudes, but there's a lack of fostering the data literacies within the institution. So, our participants showcased looking to institutions with trust. So almost like following the leader. But institutions are not taking data literacy actions. So we included a couple quotes from participants. And essentially, what institutions are doing is they're saying if there is any type of data literacy workshop or opportunity for expanding knowledge and learning, it's essentially how you can use the analytics, but it's not focusing on how to understand the data itself.
The other thing that came out of particularly our case study, we conducted the interviews for this in the late fall of 2021. And since then, I would say that at least in my own environment, I'm seeing only an amplification of this, but teaching is a lot right now. I love this cartoon. Here's a well-being seminar. Yeah. Educators care about this as well as about their students, and want to be able to engage with their work in academia in a holistic way where they are fostering students as human beings and caring for them and giving them knowledge about the world, and engaging in sort of curiosity about the world. But there are very few supports that enable educators to do so, particularly in relation to that sort of datafied infrastructure of the contemporary institution. These shifts are coming faster than institutional responses, and educators are mostly being left to navigate them without a lot of ownership. That also means that educators are being asked to navigate these changes without being able to acculturate students to them. Yes, I never ever want to talk about the term digital natives. I don't believe that students are digital natives, but sure, most of my students are pretty adept at using their phones and digital tools, but not necessarily in an educational way. They are not naturally just adept at navigating this click yes culture that they have kind of through no fault of their own inherited. And we ask faculty to teach them, but faculty, as our research shows, cannot teach them about the datafication in our society, about their own data privacy. And if that's not happening at the higher ed level, where exactly in our culture are those conversations going to happen? So our main conclusions coming out of our work are that data literacies for faculty, but with the intent of it expanding certainly to include students, needs to be a sector responsibility, that somehow we need to find a way to push for conversations across higher ed, not just on our campuses, but actually at the big picture level. I screenshot this last week. Google and Microsoft's chatbots are already citing one another in a misinformation shit show. As we see AI being incorporated into our search mechanisms as a society, those of us whose careers are based on certain kinds of knowledge are going to find that even the tools that we use for search are increasingly deeply, deeply polluted. We are not as knowledgeable as we could and should be, through no fault of our own, of the domains in which we teach, right? We don't, and I don't mean our disciplinary knowledge, but literally our knowledge about higher ed and how it is held and cobbled together at this point. If we are to maintain any sense of academics as having a meaning and faculty as having a meaningful place in academic governance, right? Where we are voices that contribute along with boards and administration to the direction that our institutions should take. And I think that our research points to the fact that that's really important, because it is valuable that perhaps these are not entirely, or that higher ed is not entirely led by a cobbled together mishmash of corporations with different interests. We need to understand what academia is right now and how we are not necessarily in the little red schoolhouse, right? We need to be able to navigate all of these data tripwires so that we can teach our students how to do so, and so that we can move towards a future that perhaps preserves some of the higher ed mandates that some of us value. But to do that, coming out of our research, the things that we're seeing are that we need multi-level campus conversations, the kind that all of us are having some difficulties initiating. We need plain language data communications, not 17-page terms of service, but hey, this is what this means for you and your students in a couple of lines. We need a sector focus on data ethics and literacy. And we need a sector focus on perhaps banding together as a sector and saying, okay, vendors, you know what? We want student-facing tools to have these particular limits on them. We want to understand that student data is not necessarily being third-party brokered to entities that might therefore lead to student deportation, etc. Our main point, and this is Sophia Noble, if you're not familiar with her work, Algorithms of Oppression, is let us try, because we have the cultural space within higher ed at this moment, and if we don't protect it, we won't have it that much longer, to try to untangle and diffuse some of these tripwires rather than reinforce them. She says the new kinds of ungovernable AI and digital technology that's coming into the marketplace is probably going to be the most important human rights issue of the 21st century. And looking at this from our institutional perspectives is something that our research has indicated to us is a really important conversation for us to be having across all the different disciplines and spaces in our universities that we take up. But we are not 100% sure, other than hosting conversations like this, how to do that. So we would like to open the chat again and ask, does anybody have any ideas about things that we would like to see happen and that we can do as individuals within institutions, within a sector about this? We're now here for both your questions, but also your ideas and conversations. And folks are welcome to take the mic as well. It's kind of one of those don't all talk at once pieces. Yeah. Does anybody see any avenues or channels that we could band together on? Okay, can you say more about that, Lucas?
I'm ashamed to admit that I don't want to say that TikTok is doing it right, but anyone that's been following the congressional hearing and the steps that they're promising to make to protect American data is quite interesting. You know, that they're saying, for those that haven't been following it, the CEO has been under scrutiny with what TikTok does with their data, and they're committing to putting all the American data in the United States at a corporation with American employees and third-party audits. So I don't know where these third-party auditors are coming from, or if this is a new sector or industry, but I think that having people that specialize in this sort of area of data access and privacy is a really interesting concept. And again, I'm a little embarrassed to say that it's sort of a TikTok thing, but that's where I was going with that independent third-party audit.
I think that's really interesting. I think the whole TikTok conversation has been really interesting because I feel like in some ways it's a red herring for what is really more of a hi, let's do the Cold War again, but with China, because I don't remember us paying very much attention to, Facebook's obvious, stated, egregious breaches of all kinds of data issues. But I am glad that we're talking about data nonetheless. Mita saying many advocate that we need to press for data brokers to be regulated. And I think that that is probably, again, I have only learned the term data brokers in the last year, actually, thanks to Mita, so appreciation. But if we don't know about these things, we can't talk about them. If we don't know about these things, we can't advocate for them. So I think that, for instance, Robin has shared a link up in the chat about a session that's happening through Plymouth later this month, Envisioning the Privacy Aware Professor. And it's a great panel with some excellent people on it, and I encourage you to sign up for it. George has mentioned local agreements like the one at Athabasca. And I'm sorry, George, because Athabasca has been, it's a Canadian online university for those of you who may not be aware, but they've had some very significant local political issues, and that led to the ouster of their president, etc. Problems, but they do have, thanks to their former deputy provost, an excellent data privacy document for sure. And I think George has shared that in the chat. Sybil, I appreciate what you're saying. I'd like to see an acknowledgement that my campus doesn't know where our data goes and that we don't know what student data is being used by Blackboard. And yeah, Robin says, I think I'm most focused on the click yes culture and asking people to maybe pause and think and ask. One of the things that I'd asked Sam and Erica to do over the last year is to try to find information and even just things that we could cite about that click yes culture. And we all know it, right? If you talk to anybody in a room, hey, do you read the terms of service before you click them? No. But it's almost like we're goldfish and this is the water that we're swimming in, but we're not really talking about it. Lucas has a Black Mirror recommendation. And yeah, that transparency, Sam, is really, really important for sure. Does anybody have any questions, particularly for my fabulous RAs that they would like to put out? Oh, I'm reading what George has put up. The internet is the supreme example of an impersonal and inflexible system, which will provide information if you do all the hard work of searching for it, but crucially doesn't promise anything as a reward for all the effort, will never engage in dialogue, is much, much bigger than you are, and only exists in a virtual kind of way, so never has to apologize. That's from 2005. It's fascinating. Yeah, and again, I am concerned about what happens to chat over the coming months, particularly. I saw Lucas's hand, so I'm going to turn the mic over to you, Lucas, and then I'll leave the chat here where Sam was, and then Kate, so we can address those points too.
I'm gonna try and make a question and not ramble on about all the things that make me excited, but I'm curious to ask your RAs, and I know Erica and Sam, I don't know you, but about your thoughts on, and I know Erica's a faculty of education, and as are you, Bonnie, the sort of pressures that come with being a part of a faculty of education with some of these issues, because I think as a faculty of education, we're supposed to know more about education and teaching and learning and some of these concerns. And we're situated in higher education where sometimes knowledge transfer or teaching and learning happen in very different ways. And I at least feel and see at my institution that they don't necessarily always come to the faculty of education, like the sudden shift to online learning. Yes, we had support at my institution from our teaching commons and other folks, but nobody really came to the faculty of education and said, hey, what do we know about teaching and learning online and how do we do it? So I liken a parallel here, and I'm curious on anyone on the panel's perspective about how faculties of education, and Sam, I apologize, I think you're an MN student, right? So yeah, how we can sort of fight that fight or bring those conversations to the forefront in institutions that maybe there's a chance that folks that are doing research in education might have more to say about the job of education in higher ed. So sorry, that was long and complicated. Go wherever you want with it.
I can go first, I guess. So actually, I've been working in the Student Success and Leadership Center we have on campus, the University of Windsor. And my role is pretty much responsible for helping students get connected to different resources and supports we have on campus and in the community as well. But it's very interesting to see how many students actually come to me. And so we moved to Brightspace at the beginning of this semester, I believe. But all through my undergrad and most of my master's, I use Blackboard. And so it was very interesting to see that with the shift from Blackboard to Brightspace happening for students, and a lot of students who have already, done a couple years of schooling, there was not a lot of talk about how we're transitioning. And so I think just being transparent about that kind of stuff, because in my experience, I wasn't doing any more classes. And so I had to go and spend some of my own time researching, okay, what is Brightspace? How do we use it? How is it different from Blackboard? Like the specifics that students were asking questions, because there just wasn't that conversation happening in the institution.
I would add, oh, sorry, go ahead.
I was going to say, how about you, Erica? That was.
I have a multiple perspective, I guess, because I started teaching at the faculty. So I have I guess I don't want to call myself faculty because I'm not faculty, but the instructor view as well as the student view. I know Lucas can share that with me that for our DS1 or the summer sessions for our PhD program, we were supposed to be in person and both of them were virtual. And I know that none of us really had any prep time or any kind of instruction on what to do before getting on. I more or less knew Zoom and could figure it out. But I know other people in the course were having trouble with even logging onto Zoom or figuring out how to engage with the course in a meaningful way, because it was supposed to be in person and it was shuffled online at the last minute. And we had 2 summers in a row that were the same format. And it was a long day. We spent many, I can't remember, I think 4 or 5 hours straight on the computer. And it was very overwhelming for a new student in a new program, taking their first course, to be spending that much time in front of the computer in a new kind of format. And then from the teaching perspective, I would say be mindful of what you're using when you're teaching students. I try to explain that to them. I teach media literacy, so I try to make them a little bit aware of it. We recently did, we looked at Instagram and the tracking that it does. And I told them in class to go on their phone and look to see if it was on. And some of them were like, oh my gosh, it's on. And they were freaking out. And I think that firsthand knowledge of walking them through the process of turning off certain things that they would find helpful and relatable is important as an educator as well.
I think there's a lot of awareness raising that is, especially I teach teachers as you do, right? That's part of the Faculty of Education role. And so I try to think about my students as people who will then be teaching their own students. And so any kind of critical awareness that I'm building and critical practices that I'm building will hopefully be things that they pass on to the next generation. But yeah, there are both specifics, those process things about what kind of tracking does your phone have on you, but also just the bigger picture permission that, it's hard to look at this stuff because it becomes overwhelming really quickly. But at the same time, we are allowed to be curious and critical of these things. And I try to design a lot of my Faculty of Ed and BEd assignments around kind of building that sort of critical investigative, okay, let's learn about digital technologies while asking who's profiting from this? How does this work? But to go back to some of the questions further up. Like Kate had said, I'd like more people to consider privacy and data from a critical perspective. On her campus, she's the only one currently kind of in that space and afraid to speak up too much in case someone does call for an audit. We almost, I think that those of us who are here, who have chosen to join, and I'm so grateful that you did, are the people who are interested, and at least, you know, aware of that paradigm level shift that I mentioned coming out of our research. And we seem to need a really significant, not just awareness raising process, but this actually matters and could make a difference piece. And I think that that gap between, okay, this is a problem, but can we do anything about it? I would love to figure out how we band together to push for believing that we can make a difference and envisioning what that might mean. Erwin asks about institutions working together to promote, host, and support more open source systems. And the intersection between this and open is one that is really interesting to me. Does anybody else, in like Robin, Mita, Dave, Kate, George, any thoughts about that intersection of open and all of these issues? We have about 5 minutes left before we're going to, before I have to go to an appointments committee meeting. So
I'll say something if you want.
I'd love that.
I will just quote somebody really smart who wasn't me, and it was like probably you or Dave. I have no idea. Or somebody from Open, like Cable or whatever. But somebody said, it was very clarifying to me that open is not the opposite of private. And one of the, I think as the more I've done an open, the more I've realized like, oh gosh, that's actually the understatement of the year. That open is in so many ways, I think, that privacy in so many ways is at the heart of a healthy commons and a healthy sort of like, you know, open sharing of knowledge. Tara Robertson was very instrumental to me in thinking about those things too, about the ethics of sharing and some of the work that Indigenous scholars have done on that stuff too. So I think a lot of this is also wrapped up in just, you know, there's other pieces for open around colonialism as well. And like, you know, forced sharing. So I guess one of the things I would like, just like with the culture of click is really, we just have to have much more conversation. I think it's part of this, like, you know, information ecosystem that one of my librarians always talks about. And I just look around higher ed and I see almost everything is like enmeshed with how we think about the information ecosystem. And we so rarely make those conversations explicit, like just the dorky, weird people like us in this, you know, in this thing, but it's like not part of regular disciplines. It's not part of faculty trainings generally. So I feel like it's become such a more evident key. And I think a lot of people who work in tech, when we get to that phase, which like most of us get to, where you're like, oh my God, tech is garbage. I need to go live in the woods, you know? And people are always like, that's so weird. I thought you were like the tech guru. And I think that somehow we have to help people who are not enmeshed in like ed tech all the time understand where our criticality is coming from. I don't think we've done a very good job of that. You know, so far, but that was just a lot of, I mean, you're making me think of so many things. So anyway, that was just a bleh.
I appreciate it. I really like the point that open is not the opposite of private. And I hope that no one takes offense that Robin called us all weird. Dave, is your hand up?
It was. Yeah, I think the other piece for me is where the intersection is that you're talking about is around transparency. So as we move into this AI generated business that's coming in, that also is a whole data world behind there and the way that gets generated and all that stuff. And to me, open here is not necessarily open as in, you know, open. There's privacy there, but I think it's the transparency. This is who I am, and this is the engagement that you're getting into interacting with me. And to me, we got to be open to all of those pieces. When we talk about widening participation, part of that's about decoding the structures that underlie the systems that we're using and being transparent about those things.
I think that's
Plus, I mean, I agree with Robin, obviously.
No, I think that's true. And I think there's another piece. There was both a point that George made. Do you want to say anything more about that paradigm shift, George?
Yeah, I've got a spotty connection in construction here, but I'm next door. My just observation, what you were saying earlier about the paradigm shift, I just want to bring that back, Bonnie. And I just really think that we're at the level where we start a conversation, we're willing to talk about it, for example, for this hour, and then at our own institutions, it's hard to keep that conversation going. So, yeah, it's like, okay, I'm going to go back, make people watch this hour. And then can we have sessions that are just about everything that blossomed during this conversation? And that feels like a hurdle because of our institutional silos, our various colleges, my College of Ed, and our Centers for Teaching, Learning, and Assessment, and our Academic Technologies folks. The latter two talk to each other all the time, but not with the College of Ed. So we're approaching pedagogy from these, especially for teachers, from these different viewpoints. And so I'm hoping a conversation like this one today will help bridge that. And I'm going to see what happens this time. Might need some ideas for approaching it differently so that it's a paradigm shift and not a one-off. I think that may be our challenge.
I think that is part of our challenge. Thank you for that. And I think this will be going up on YouTube, just so that folks know. And if you do have any places to share it, we welcome that. But maybe I will give the last word. I noticed something that Mita, who's here in Windsor, said upstream in the chat. Mita, do you want to make your point about libraries on screen? No need, no pressure. Mita's point was partner with your librarians. And maybe that is one element of this kind of campus bringing together conversation that we can try to work towards, because we have a whole lot of segmented types of knowledge that I think libraries are one of the places where we might be able to do better if we pull together with those. So on that note, partner with your librarians, try to have paradigm conversations. Let's keep talking to each other. I will share the YouTube link with everybody by email once it is up. And I appreciate all of you for being here today. Thank you very, very, very much. Take care. Have a wonderful day.